Hello, Neural Network listeners. These are your co-hosts, Vasu Lakshmanan.
And Armand Priyadarshan.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Michael Frank, a professor of cognitive, linguistic, and psychological science at Brown University.
Dr. Frank, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Michael. I am from Montreal. I study brain science. As well as being a professor of cognitive science, I am also the director of the Center for Computational Brain Science at Brown University, which focuses on multiple levels of analysis of trying to understand the brain from a computational perspective, all the way from low ends of modeling molecules and neurons, all the way up to artificial intelligence.
hmm And what motivated you to pursue your current research interests?
My current research interests. Well, that depends on how narrowly you want to focus that question on, but I'll give you the short story version of my sort of trajectory as I started off in electrical engineering in my undergraduate training, because I really liked kind of math and physics and computational sciences. And but eventually I worked for a startup, not a startup, a cell phone company. And I kind of liked what I was doing on a day-to-day basis, but wasn't really satisfied at the end of the day of what I was doing. So I wanted to apply engineering towards something medical. Went on and did a master's in biomedical engineering. And along the way, I took some courses, particularly one called Brains, Minds, and Computers, which is really about how brains and computers are similar to each other in some ways, but very different in other ways. And I was very intrigued by that and took a few more courses on neural networks and computer science, and then ultimately was led to do a PhD in computational neuroscience, which was sort of using neural networks, but in a way that tries to mimic certain aspects of brain function. And I've always been, once I started developing my own models of certain parts of the brain and how they work, I realized that they made some new predictions that can explain diseases and effects of, for example, different medications that are given to different patient populations that make help us try to understand the connection between these mechanisms in the brain and sort of behavioral phenomena and intelligence and so forth. And I found that quite motivating. And since then, I've just expanded to many aspects of trying to understand intersections between motivation and cognition and decision making from a computational perspective.
That's awesome. I know like cognitive science is a really interdisciplinary field. And actually, we had like a question later prepared to ask about how that transition from electrical engineering to neuroscience kind of went. But to kind of just address that now, do you have like any advice that you'd give to students who are considering a similar interdisciplinary path?
Yeah, I mean, I think if they want to go into computational field of neuroscience or cognitive science or something like that, it definitely helps to have some of the theoretical, technical foundations early on, and then learn the domain that you're studying afterwards. It can work the other way around, but it's just a little bit less frequent that if you start off learning something like psychology or neuroscience without any technical background, then learning the sort of computational math side after is just harder. So uh, I guess encouraging people to get the foundations early on the technical side, but also, and at least as important, is if you come from a theoretical like physics or math background, and then you want to go into a domain, there is a risk sometimes of people like that who want to live in a little theoretical corner and not connect it to real data and just want to have sort of a beautiful model of something that doesn't actually relate to biology in our case. So it is really important also to really pay attention to what the literature and what all that hard work a lot of other people are doing. Uh, just pay attention to that. And I feel like that's almost like a luxury and a duty of a computational or theoretical person, because the luxury is that we spend a lot of our time thinking about interesting theories and programming and connecting it to experiments. But a lot of the really informative work that allows us to constrain our models comes from really hard uh, setups with, genetic engineering or lots of other things that people are spending a lot of time working on. And we don't have to do that if we're the theorists, but that means we should read that and understand the sort of the benefits and the pitfalls of those different methods and all the findings that sometimes don't always fit together. And I think it's important that becomes an interesting puzzle for us to try to solve is why is there like one set of findings that seem to point to one direction, another set of findings to another direction. And sometimes that's really a good clue for a good theory that can tie it together. Sometimes it's more of like some nuisance of some particular method was like actually shouldn't be interpreted in the way that you think it should be interpreted. So that's one of the things that we have to sort out. But again, I think people should spend enough time paying attention to the real data.
Yeah, absolutely. I really liked how you talked about how we should not only look at the theoretical aspect, but alongside that, the practical applications inside the field as well. I was wondering what were some soft and technical skills from electrical engineering that you found that have helped you inside your neuroscience research currently?
Did you say soft and technical skills?
Yeah, yeah, both types of skills, really.
Oh, I see. I mean, on the technical side, I just had some background in differential equations and linear algebra and calculus and just doing some programming and thinking about things from an engineering standpoint of doing systems, like, when a good engineer will figure out how to test a system isolated from other systems and not try to just put everything together and hope that it works. And if it doesn't work. So I think those kind of skills are really translatable to doing science in a good controlled way, even if it's not on the technical side, just like figuring out how to isolate systems. But certainly the technical part helped me in my particular field of computational neuroscience. Some of it was like really directly translating, like when I first learned about modeling neurons, there are cable equations of neurons that really use equivalent circuit models that come from electrical engineering. And so having that being sort of prepared on how to understand those circuit models was definitely helpful for me to think about it. Um, as well as I'm not sure if this directly answers your question, but maybe it's helpful. Before I went into computational neuroscience, I did take one course on neurobiology as a beginning graduate student in biomedical engineering. And I honestly found it really hard to pay attention to for a while because it was, a huge book and huge amounts of material, and a lot of it was just sort of rote memorization. Here are a bunch of facts about neurons and about different chemicals and receptors and so forth. But once I had then taken neural network theory and other courses, it really made me think about the biology data from a totally different standpoint of saying, well, how can we sort of connect all these facts in a way that is trying to solve a puzzle about what the system might be trying to do. And so that sort of way of thinking from an engineering standpoint of reverse engineering was really helpful in, at least for me, in motivating me to care more about the actual details of the biology.
Yeah, for sure. I know like this year I'm taking like some coursework in differential equations and a lot of other like math topics. We get to cover like a bunch of different like modeling aspects of that and kind of applying it to a bunch of different fields. I can definitely see like how that could be like really useful in neuroscience and cognitive science. And in your research, would you say there's like a project that you're the most proud of?
Oh, that's difficult. Because I'm always interested in expanding different areas. Um, I don't know. I guess I'll say something that I've been doing for the longest, which is trying to understand a system in the brain called the basal ganglia, which is a collection of structures that is really primitive in that it's shared with many other species, going down to even reptiles, but most consistently with rodents and non-human primates. And for a long time, prior to like the early 2000s, it was thought that that set of brain areas was involved in movement control because you have patients that have damage to that area of one form or another, have problems moving, they have tremor, they have unwanted movements, or they have problems initiating movements. So I'm thinking of like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and Tourette syndrome. Um, but what my sort of first theoretical model, at least the one that I built myself, was really about how you could extend the sort of the circuitry that helps to solve the selection of movement actions. Like how does the brain select between different movement actions when you're considering what to do? sort of marrying that with the idea that the brain has scaffold on top of it, it starts off building on a primitive sort of motor system. And as you go more forward in the brain, the actions that you're considering are more and more abstract. Like instead of just muscle movements, it might be like preparing to reach. And from there, it might be, I want to get a coffee. And from there, it might be, what do I tend to when I'm having this conversation with you? Should I hold something? Should I hold certain thoughts in mind, or should I suppress other things because they're distracting? And it gets more abstract from there. And it turns out that all of those things can be cast in terms of different kinds of actions, just actions at different levels of abstraction. And when you build models of the circuitry, you can show how similar principles for selecting between different movements can also be used. And we think the brain has co-adopted that or co-opted that mechanism to select among different cognitive actions and also making decisions. And moreover, that all of that process from the movements all the way up to the more abstract cognitive actions is really driven by motivational variables and reinforcement learning and sort of cost benefit kinds of analysis. So if I had to say what I was most proud of, it's sort of trying to make that connection and saying that there's a lot that we can understand about action more generally and also about disease and treatments that affect disease. So I've done a lot of work in Parkinson's patients to show how different kinds of treatments can affect their decision making and learning in different ways that wasn't really appreciated before this sort of general theoretical framework had been applied.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned like reinforcement learning. Your explanation of like the levels of like abstraction and kind of these cognitive processes kind of ties in a little bit more to that. I know like in like some projects I've seen like Q-star learning or other kinds of learning that kind of have more simplistic actions at first. Like for example, I've seen like some Tetris bots online that will like kind of learn how to play like the very basics first, like clearing lines, like just stacking them so that there's no holes and then go on to like more advanced movements, like as you mentioned, like kind of more abstract, as in like doing spins and doing like complex movements and stuff like that. Like the level that those things have gone to is really awesome, and I think like the relevance of your model, especially with your work in patients, is really really interesting. And to build more on that reinforcement learning aspect, could you explain like in layman's terms how reinforcement learning relates to cognitive control in the brain?
Yeah, well, I guess I just began to start saying that in the sense that cognitive control is really about selecting actions that are not the most obvious dominant actions that just come up from a bottom-up standpoint, right? So one of the classic examples is if you go to the UK and you're normally uh, in the US or in other parts of the world, people drive on the other side of the street. So when you're crossing the road, your initial tendency is to look left because that's where the cars are coming from the right. But you have to know that suddenly you're in it, the rules are different. And so you need to stop yourself from doing the initial thing and switch to the other thing, the other side. Um, and that's a very simple aspect of cognitive control, which is essentially detecting conflict between your dominant behavioral tendency, and some rule that is subject to some contextual factor. In that case, the contextual factor is you're in a different country and the sort of the norms and the rules are different. Um, but the decision to do that, to engage in cognitive control at all, and also which actions you should select given the rules that you're in, again, involve a set of sort of a competition in your brain between like which should I select this particular action, like going left or going right, or should I also select an action which might be consult my prefrontal cortex, which has information about what the rules are, and use that to then feed back down into your movement action selection mechanism to then make the decision. So then it becomes kind of hierarchical because you still have one sort of system for selecting the movements of left versus right. But above that, you have another system that says, wait a minute, what should I should check what the abstract action is, and the sort of rules here are different. And so I need to select that, which then constrains what I select at the low level. And both of those levels, and it expands to multiple levels beyond that, are all subject to influences of dopamine, which is a chemical in the brain that is very heavily implicated in reinforcement learning in a really nice set of studies over the last 25 years. linking dopamine sort of patterns of activity to basic principles from reinforcement learning, which I can go into if that's helpful. But essentially, we think, and we've done a bunch of work, both theoretically and empirically, as have other people, showing that the sort of basic principles by which dopamine alters action selection on the sort of motor side also operate on the cognitive side and cognitive control.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like a really good example that you mentioned because it's something that like I know a lot of people can relate to because when I've traveled inside other countries, that's something that I always have to think like twice about, even though I'm not inside the driver's seat. So I definitely thought that was very interesting. Pivoting to like a different yet similar field of your research of computational psychiatry, I was wondering how do you see the field of computational psychiatry evolving in the coming years with AI and in some forms without AI as well?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the goal for computational psychiatry is to develop better, or one goal, at least the kind of flavor of computational psychiatry that I'm most engaged in, is to sort of develop better computational neuroscience theories about the brain and how the brain is solving different problems, different trade-offs between, let's say, immediate and future rewards or exploration versus exploitation. That's a classic trade-off in reinforcement learning, like how much do you explore different strategies before you exploit the one that you think is the best. And there are many sort of trade-offs like that that we as a field study how the brain sort of solves those trade-offs and figures out what strategy to use at what point in time. And I think trying to understand that and how that can go awry if you have alterations in the underlying circuit that mediates those trade-offs is something that can be useful for understanding mental illness and neurological disorders. I'd say we've had, again, I mean the field, some success in understanding some disorders in that way. And the ones that cl are closer to neurology are easier to say we've made more progress on, like Parkinson's disease. Although even in Parkinson's disease, there are psychiatric symptoms that some of them result actually from the treatments, from the medications, and from brain stimulation therapies that are given to them. And those are some of the things that we're trying to understand, or we do have some models of how that can happen. But then you can also apply some of the models to other more complex mental illnesses like schizophrenia and depression, anxiety, ADHD. Each of those are very heterogeneous, meaning there's people that have those diagnoses have many different mechanisms that produce somewhat similar symptoms, and sometimes the symptoms aren't even similar, but they're still counted as the same disorder. So that makes it exceptionally challenging. So I think there has been a lot of momentum and attention to the field of computational psychiatry in the last, let's say, 10 years. And I hope that that continues because I think it is a good direction to take. But I also have a bit of a worry that sometimes the expectations are such that um, a particular approach is going to sort of solve a disorder. And if it doesn't, they sort of move on to the next fad of trying to solve a disorder. And I am not under any illusions that we're going to solve complex mental illness with computational psychiatry in a few years. In fact, I think if we are going in the right direction by taking these more formal approaches, then it actually should take a much longer time because you're sort of simultaneously trying to solve fundamental problems about links between brain mechanisms and computations and cognitive function, and also what defines particular mental illnesses, which is not really a hard science. A lot of it is sort of pragmatic from a diagnosis and sort of medical billing standpoint. Like a lot of psychiatrists have to agree with each other that these patients have the same disorder, therefore they can bill the insurance. That doesn't mean that they're sort of having the same underlying mechanisms. So I think as we go forward in the field, we have to figure out, how to make concrete, even if incremental progress on particular mental illnesses to show that it's the right direction to take for the big picture, which is trying to solve or help people in the longer term. And also, when is it appropriate to use theory-driven models of the type that I'm talking about versus large data-driven models that are purely driven by AI, or any kind of machine learning data science method, where sometimes that can be helpful too. If you have huge data sets, you can not necessarily have a theory about what's going on inside the brain, but you can try to analyze those data sets by looking at clusters of people that have different, let's say, patterns of brain activity or genetic factors and so forth, and see if you can start to stratify them and predict who will, let's say, benefit from one treatment versus the other. And that's a totally valid approach as well. I think it just requires a lot more data to get useful signal in. And so one of the ongoing, I think, challenges and ways that the field is going is trying to figure out to what degree we should use one of those methods or the other, or in some cases, you can actually combine the two of them.
You mentioned that your research has had a bunch of implications for various like neurological and psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and Parkinson's. So something that I was wondering about is which disorder do you think has benefited the most from the application of computational approaches in terms of like personalized treatment strategies and other kind of things?